Here to help us break down the current state of the election is Tim Murtaugh, the director of communications for the 2020 Trump campaign. Tim, yesterday we saw a pretty heated debate take place on CNN between Jenna Ellis and Brian Stelter. We know that the Trump campaign is now asking for an apology, but I want to get to the root of where that really came from. It came back to the idea that CNN was conducting polls in a way that may be misleading to many viewers, only conducting among, I think it was 25% among Republicans. How do you respond not only to that poll, but also what you saw on reliable sources on Sunday morning?
Well, sure. CNN is conducting polls and publishing them in the hopes of actually creating a narrative, not actually taking a snapshot. This is advocacy journalism, and we know for sure all you have to do is just watch that segment that you just played, and you can tell that CNN has chosen sides, and they chose it a long time ago. And Brian Stelter and his treatment of Jenna Ellis there, it's just unimaginable. I mean, here you have a guy who's essentially putting words into the mouths of Jenna Ellis's children and supposed grandchildren, saying that they'll look back on her and be ashamed of their mother or grandmother for her advocacy for the president of the United States. I mean, that's absurd. And so it's not journalism anymore. It's partisan activism. It's advocacy for one party and against another party, and more specifically, advocacy against President Trump. And so it's really an offensive way that Brian Stelter approached Jenna Ellis to yell at her and say, your children and your grandchildren will be ashamed of what you did. Essentially, I mean, that's ridiculous. What in the world can you imagine, say, Walter Cronkite yelling at a guest and taking a guess at what the children and grandchildren of that guest would think? I mean, it's really unimaginable. But that is what passes for journalism these days, and most notably at CNN.
And it shouldn't be too much of a surprise to people who have been paying attention to the relationship between CNN and the president over the past 3 years. It's been a very adversarial one. In fact, Chris Wallace over the weekend even said himself that a lot of reporters right now are being so anti-Trump where they're no longer calling balls and strikes. And I think it's very detrimental to the industry as a whole. It's something that actually troubles me a lot. But at the end of the day, it's not so much about what those in the media say. It's about what the American people say. And in fact, you could say that they're not tuning into that show very much, so they might be feeling the same way. But when we look at, for example, the amount of tickets that were sold at the Tulsa rally in Oklahoma, that within itself is a very extraordinary number. And add that to yesterday's record total. I believe it was $14 million raised in one day for the Trump campaign. There is a lot of support behind the Trump campaign, regardless of what that poll says. What does that tell you?
It tells us that there's a tremendous enthusiasm behind President Trump's reelection, no question about that. This rally that we're holding in Tulsa, Oklahoma on Saturday, as you said, more than 1 million ticket requests already, and we're still, 5 days away from the rally, and that is definitely a record for ticket requests. We always, for rallies, get more requests than the capacity of the arena. In this case, it's just really monstrous reaction from the Trump supporters, and we know there's a lot of pent-up enthusiasm for the president's supporters out there. They've been waiting for him to return to the campaign trail, and the president himself has been very eager to do that. And it's going to be just a great scene. And that, coupled with the fact that the president's campaign raised $14 million in online donations only in one day yesterday to mark the president's birthday, as a matter of fact. I mean, that just shows tremendous grassroots strength. And you contrast that with Joe Biden's very sleepy campaign, and you know that a giant and loud and boisterous rally crowd like we're going to see on Saturday is something that Joe Biden can only dream of. And so this will show the real contrast between the two campaigns and the two approaches. President Trump, all the great enthusiasm and the optimism for the country, and just the doldrums and the sleepiness of Joe Biden's campaign.
And in fact, Terry McAuliffe, who was a co-chair for the Clinton campaign, is now a Biden surrogate. He said that the best thing that Biden could do right now is stay in the basement. And I think that's very telling coming from an insider of that campaign of what's to come ahead. Of course, we still have debates. We still have a lot to go before the election takes place. But we see a lot of developments taking place right now and a lot coming from the far left. That being what we're seeing right now in the Seattle Chaz, for example. I mean, what's going on there is a pretty remarkable scene. And it's a little bit wild to me that a lot of people in the media are trying to approach it from an objective standpoint, because if anybody else in this country tried doing that, there would be an uproar. I mean, it's people essentially taking over part of a major American city and calling it their own autonomous country. So from an election standpoint, how do you capitalize on events such as that or calls to defund the police?
Well, this Chaz in Seattle is really a Biden zone. It's a police-free zone. It's a Joe Biden zone. The mayor there, Mayor Durkin, Jenny Durkin, is a Joe Biden supporter. She has endorsed Joe Biden. And her idea of leadership is to completely withdraw the police from the area, have turned over a police precinct building to the protesters and the occupiers there. And she calls that leadership. And in fact, she says, oh, it's like a block party. It's a festival atmosphere in there. Well, I mean, that's craziness if that's what people think qualifies as leadership. But the defund the police movement is sweeping the Democrat Party. You see it in cities from coast to coast. The mayor of New York, Bill de Blasio, Garcetti in Los Angeles, the entire Minneapolis City Council, the mayor of San Francisco, variety of members of Congress, AOC and Ilhan Omar and Benny Thompson and others saying that, yes, defund the police. And also, they all agree on that, but they also have one other thing in common, and that's that they have all endorsed Joe Biden. And all Joe Biden has ever said is one sentence, uttered one sentence, very mealy-mouthed in a way, saying, well, I really don't support that. But he hasn't taken a stand. He has proven that he cannot stand up to the extreme wing of his party. He's done that over and over again. He's proven that he can't stand up to them. And on this defund the police movement, you know, this is something, this movement has left the Democrat station. This is a train that has left the Democrat station. And Joe Biden is just a helpless passenger on that train. And so, absolutely, when people see these scenes on television, they ought to remember that these are the leaders who are flocking to Joe Biden's side. And that ought to be really, really glaring and really jarring for a lot of Americans.
And I think when we look at Joe Biden, too, he does have a record of saying one thing, voting on one thing, and then when it becomes popular to say the other, he flip-flops. I mean, we could talk about the 1994 crime bill, the Iraq war vote, NAFTA support, all of those things he at one point supported, and now as the tide has shifted a little bit, he's saying the other thing. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if these defund the police calls continued from the left part of the Democratic Party, that we'll see Joe Biden soon making those very same calls. It wouldn't surprise me at all. But Tim Murtaugh, I appreciate you coming on.
Wouldn't be surprising.